Chairman Thornberry, we cannot thank you enough for spending a few minutes with us here at the Reagan Library.
Sure, it's an honor. Thank you.
Just great to have you. I have a few questions for you, and obviously with your role as the Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, your voice on some of the questions that I'll ask is particularly important. And I'll start with sequestration. You know, I remember in the last couple of years as we held this forum, the cloud of sequestration was growing. There was a very wide concern that if sequestration occurred, it would just literally turn the Defense Department upside down. And now that we're actually living in this very austere budget time, tell me, are we seeing damage done to the military? Is our preparedness really at risk now?
Yeah, there's no question about that. The answer is yes. If you look at defense spending and count the effects of inflation, we cut defense 21% from 2010 to 2014. And the world is not 21% safer today than it was in 2010. So there's been real damage. And then meanwhile, we've been fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, for Iraq at least a portion of that time. And so we were never able to build back up the readiness, to repair the readiness damage that has been done. So recently Congress had an agreement for 2 years of spending levels, defense and non-defense, that helps to turn that around. It's not nearly enough to fix all of that damage, but at least we're not digging the hole deeper.
Yeah. You know, the kind of holes that one had to fill in the Reagan era in terms of funds and ensuring that we kept the peace. I remember at the time the war-fighting capability that the armed services had to have. Essentially the rule was, well, you know, the United States needs to be prepared to fight two conventional wars, two major wars at any one time and succeed. How does the Armed Services Committee and generally the armed forces look at that goal? Is that still the position of the United States, or is that, no, that's not the way we look at it anymore?
It's not really the standard by which we measure, and I think there's two things. One is, in recent years, we've had a standard that moves to kind of fit the budget, and that's not the way it should be. You ought to have a strategy and a budget to implement that strategy, and we've really turned that around. It is true, though, the second thing is we face more serious, complex threats to our national security now, all at the same time, than we have ever faced before. Now, you can argue whether the Cold War that President Reagan faced was a bigger threat in and of itself, because obviously our existence as a nation was threatened. But today, you look at a resurgent Russia, as well as China, and Iran, and North Korea, and terrorism with dueling terrorist groups. You also have cyber attacks. You have countries that are trying to deny us the use of space. And you have biological threats. You just have all of these things together. It makes it even more challenging to have a planning standard. But I think one of the concerns a lot of people have is we don't really have a strategy. We just have a certain amount of money and just try to do the best we can with it.
Yeah, that's got to make your job as chairman very difficult.
It is. I will say, we are really trying to focus in both the House and the Senate to make better use of the money we have. So part of that is efficiency, but more importantly, it's agility so that it doesn't take us 20 years to buy a new airplane, for example. So we are really trying to improve the acquisition system, the personnel system, and reduce the bureaucracy of the Pentagon to meet be able to meet the threats that are coming at us.
Quick question about Afghanistan, Iraq. It certainly seemed that the president, from the first day of his first term all the way to the present day, is as hesitant as he can ever possibly be about wanting troops on the ground in either of those pieces of the theater. Yet it now seems perhaps maybe there's light bulbs going off in the White House that it's not possible to achieve any of our objectives in either of those areas if we don't have some semblance of a force on the ground. This is not something we can win just by the air or drones or what have you. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think that's true. And one of the major criticisms a lot of national security professionals have had against this White House is that too many of the decisions have been driven by domestic political considerations, not about how to be successful. And so you end up getting twisted into knots about what's boots on the ground, what's not boots on the ground, and none of that is reassuring to our allies. And I do think one fundamental issue here is that we can't do everything on our own. We have to work with others, but we have to be a reliable partner to work with others. And there are more doubts about the United States as a partner, partly for these reasons. They don't know what's going to come out of the White House. And that has complicated our efforts. If there's anything we should have learned, however, from the debacle of Iraq, it is that leaving too soon will result in a disaster. I think that's the reason the President decided not to pull everybody out of Afghanistan like he originally intended. But still we're seeing some half measures and partial deployments and so forth that don't result in success. Maybe they're trying to avoid catastrophe, but they are not resulting in success.
Yeah, it seems to me he's living out his presidency, wanting to be able to make the claim that he got us out. And that's important above all else.
And it's basically playing out the clock.
Yeah.
And so if you are thinking about being an ally of the United States, or if you're an adversary of the United States, you see us playing out the clock, how does that affect your decision making? I think it affects it significantly.
Yeah, this is the classic lead from behind approach, right? Yeah. Last question for you, Mr. Chairman. Russia. I think as one of our speakers in the recent panel had talked about, we're not facing the Soviet Union again. But it sure does seem like they're testing us at about every possible turn. Where do we draw the line? Now they've got the forces in Syria. They were in the Ukraine, and I'm just wondering: is there some point where you think the United States is in a posture where it just has to say, "That's it, we're in. We have to go after this"?
Well, I think the answer is yes, and there are various ways to go after this. We don't have to invade Russia, and I don't ever see us doing that. On the other hand, there is a huge bipartisan consensus in Congress, both in the House and the Senate, that says we should provide lethal assistance to Ukraine, who are willing to fight for their country and repel this aggression, but the administration refuses to give them that assistance. So there are things we can and should do to increase the price of aggression against Russia and against others, because I firmly believe that what President Reagan faced, we still faced, and that is aggressors like Putin follow that fundamental dictum Lenin is supposed to have said, that you probe with a bayonet. If you encounter mush, you keep going. If you encounter steel, you stop. Well, they haven't encountered steel. Instead, they've seen mush and retreat on behalf of the United States. So they continue to expand now in Syria as well as Crimea and Ukraine. And I also think it just reinforces that basic principle that the way to keep the world peaceful and safe is through military strength. That was the principle of President Reagan, and it still applies just as much today with all these different threats that we face.
Peace through strength.
Peace through strength.
Great. Mr. Chairman, can't thank you enough for your time. It's just great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, John.
All right.